All right, so here we go. We are starting a new series that I am very excited about. So in this series, I have no idea how many episodes it's going to be. I have no idea how long each episode is going to be. It's all going to be very improvised for the most part. But basically, we're going to be starting from the beginning of just planning a piece all the way to writing it, orchestrating it, the whole shebang. I'm going to show you my entire process, or something very similar, because my process does change per project depending on what I need to accomplish. But this is about as close to it as I can possibly get, and during the entire process, I'm going to try and share everything that I'm doing and the reasons why along the way. So without any further ado, here we have the winning character, or characters, submitted by one of my patrons, Declan Cooney. So we got some incredible characters here, by the name of Lex Sonier and Irtos Junk. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But Declan was incredibly kind and generous with the information that he shared. We're going to get to know these characters a little bit first, and then we'll start jumping right into planning stuff for them. So as you see over here, I've got the entire process written out. So I put this in a Google Doc so that it would be easier for both of us to work on it together. So I've got, normally I would have my own notebook and I'd take my notes, I'd answer all these questions myself. I'd like to go somewhere other than just a hot, stuffy office. I prefer to go for bike rides, walks, hikes, anything, just to kind of get the creative juices going. But to allow all of you to come along this process with me, I made sure to write all of it down physically into a Google Doc so I can share it on my screen. So what we have here is some information that was provided to me by Declan on the two characters that we're writing for. They're both twins, and they're both Lizardfolk, which we'll get into a little bit more about that in just a bit. But first, let's see some basics about the characters. So the first one we have is Lex Sonier, which apparently the name means word eater in Draconic, which is considered a weak name in her culture, but she likes it nonetheless. All right. Lex doesn't do a lot of talking, and oftentimes just repeats what others are saying to her, or things that she's heard others say. She's a rogue with a particularly passive burglar background. So what that means is she's all about sneaking, all about getting in undetected. So you get in, grab what you want, get out, and importantly, if possible, would rather avoid conflict, would rather not have to harm anyone while doing it. So right off the bat, that gives us a lot of information. We also, something else Declan shared was that both these characters have a bit of an obsession with eggs. So lots of characters in D&D will have these different quirks. Sometimes they have to do with backstory, sometimes they have to do with the race. But that'll be something interesting, because right off the bat, what that tells me in E and G, we can definitely spell egg with music. But we could do a couple different options here that are just coming to mind. We could do EGG as just a series of notes and try to turn that into a motif. But to me, something else I'm seeing is E and G are separated by each other by a third. So E to G is a minor third. All right, you have E, then F sharp, then G. All right, so that's 3 half steps. That's a minor third. And if we use chords that are a third apart from each other, go from E minor to, say, G minor, or E major to G major, or any combination thereof of E minors and E majors, G minors, G majors. We can use tertian harmony, meaning that we move from one chord to another chord that's a third apart, and we can do a lot with that. That's a very common technique in film music. In one of my videos recently, I talked about functional harmony. And in film music, functional harmony isn't used as commonly typically as tertian harmony, which again is just moving from chord to chord by relationships of a third. So this, right off the bat, all of this just to say E to G, in my mind, I'm thinking tertian harmony. So that's something to keep in mind. Personality traits. So the first thing she does in a new place is to take note of everything of value and where such things could be hidden. She's always calm, no matter what the situation, and she values loyalty above all else. She's loyal to a select few and has no particular ideals or values that she values more than that. And her primary character, the primary thing driving her character, the primary motivation is apparently something was stolen from her that she wants to take back. Flaws being a kleptomaniac. All right. So right off the bat, what this is telling me is a survivor. All right. Whoever this character is, well, we know who this character is. Lex, as a character to me, stands out to me as a survivor character, someone who's out just to survive and survive by any means necessary. And if we look at Irtos, we learn a little bit more about the situation. So Irtos' name means secret hammer, which is a name of weakness. Again, not a very powerful name, but and he typically goes by the basic or the English version being secret hammer instead of Irtos Junk. And he's done this ever since they were outcast from their brood. So already banishment, that goes back to that survivor thing I was talking about earlier. We've got the Rangers class. So he's a ranger, and his life predominantly focuses around providing food and shelter for him and his twin sister being Lex. And, well, she's more responsible for obtaining things of value, that being the rogue in charge of getting the money. And, of course, has that obsession with eggs that we were just talking about. So both have lived on the outskirts of society before they met others, before they met their current group of adventurers or mercenaries. His personality traits, he tends to be a bit more comfortable around animals than he is around people, and typically has a lesson for every situation. I'm thinking almost like a more violent version of Uncle Iroh here, where a lot of wisdom drawn from observing nature around him. The ideals with the ideals, he prefers the rough life of nature over modern civilization and feels abandoned by his tribe since the banishment, obviously, and responsible for his own bloodline. Last of the tribe and desires to make sure they are the last of their tribe, and they both desire to make sure their names are remembered, and he is a strong believer in the evolutionary idea of only the strong survive, survival of the fittest. All right, so if you're a little confused about what any of this has to do with music, because I'm realizing I didn't quite explain myself before we get started, all of this information is important because I'm going to need to understand the characters. I need to understand the story and what world they're coming from, so that when I start making the music, I can genuinely make music that fits for these characters. So, for example, if I wasn't keeping these characters in mind, then any music I wrote could technically be slapped on there, and it wouldn't be personalized, it wouldn't be for that character. So right now what I'm thinking is like a solo piano piece would not fit for these characters. For whatever reason, that just doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't feel like it'd be natural or make sense of anything like that. But so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to know the characters, trying to understand the context that we're working with, so that once we start planning the actual music, it'll come a lot more naturally to us. All right, so right now, we've seen a lot of stuff here, and the big ones sticking out to me are the culture here of the very survivalistic, very focuses talking about being the last of their bloodline, last of their tribe, and that being very important to them. So that right away is telling me that I want something tribal here. But to get a little more information, I did include a link. So let's learn a little bit more about what Lizardfolk actually are. So this is DnDBeyond.com. So Lizardfolk are a primitive reptilian humanoids that lurk in swamps and jungles. They are fiercely territorial. They kill when it is expedient and do whatever it takes to survive. So going back to that idea of being survivors. So lurk in swamps and jungles of the world. Territorial xenophobes. All right, so they're not very friendly to people outside their own kind. No traditional notion of morality. So going back to the idea of having no values other than just loyalty for Lex, and it was, I believe, like just the laws of nature by Irtos. That was his name. Okay, so occasions might arise when labors. The Lizardfolk usually learn firsthand that humans, dwarves, halflings, and elves can sometimes prove helpful or trustworthy. Once Lizardfolk forge ties with outsiders, they are steadfast and fierce allies. There we go. So I'm going back to that loyalty, and this is important because it's showing that these values of loyalty, these values of survival of the fittest, are cultural to these characters. Right? This isn't unique to just these characters. This is something that has to do with their cultural background. All right, so great feasts, canny crafters, so skilled artisans. That will be important later, because now I'm thinking if they're skilled artisans, chances are they probably invented a few instruments, drums, flutes, and the like. Because if they are primitive, if they are tribal, chances are a string quartet's not going to be the kind of music I want to personally go with. I want to do something that's more reflective of these characters. Lizardfolk respect and fear magic with a religious awe. Shamans lead their tribes. All right, dragon worshippers. All right, so this is all kind of cool stuff. All right. If you're interested in learning more about these or like different races or species, we got a picture of a lizardfolk here. I recommend checking out this website and learning more about them. But for now, we've got a decent picture of the context that the characters are in. So here we have a couple original pieces of artwork submitted by Declan of the characters. So this is very useful. All right, so it gives a little bit more personality. Here we see the eggs and the obsession with them again. We see both of them. It gives a lot more personality. It makes it a bit more personal. So this might be something where once I start working on trying to figure out the primary thematic ideas, these would be very useful to look at. And then we have one more of a detailed picture of what Declan says Irtos would look like. We don't quite have one for Lex just yet, but this one looks really sweet. All of these are really cool. So thanks, Declan. I thought these were incredible. I'm really glad to have these. But all right, so now it's time to get to the actual planning process. We've understood a little bit, very rushed context, because I have to confess that I already had this context. I might have been talking with Declan. He gave me all this great information on these characters. So I already have an idea of what I'm keeping in mind while I'm doing this, but I thought I would share a bit of that context with all of you as well. But so with my first impressions, this is the first thing I like to do in all my music. You see I've got my 9 basic parameters written up here just to help as a reminder. And we've talked about these in a couple different videos, about the basic parameters of music. You've got register, timbre, pitch, harmony, rhythm, tempo, texture, articulation, dynamics. These are all the different parameters that you can manipulate in music. But after that, what I would like to do is I like to think about what my first impressions of the story are, of the characters, of my music, of anything that just pops into my head right away that I want to put down. So first things first, I want to make sure I make note that this is a D&D character. All right, this is super important because D&D characters are not static. All right, so in a storyline, in a movie, in a video game, characters are much more likely to have remain a little bit more static. Their backstory doesn't shift too much. Their personality doesn't shift too much. Their goals and their fighting styles don't typically shift too much. Basically, what makes the character doesn't typically shift in a movie. All right, you have a couple key things that might change, and that's called character development. But if you start with a wizard who wants to learn to be a wizard, you're not likely to end up turning into a barbarian halfway through. And that is entirely possible in D&D. So I need to keep this in mind. Certain character development, things that might drive these characters. For example, right now, they're very much into the survival of the fittest mentality and the survivor kind of mentality. So if I put too much of that into the music, if I use that as too much of an inspiration, I run the risk of down the line having a theme that no longer fits the character. So one thing I want to make sure I put in is that the themes should reflect the most stable aspects of the characters. For example, the culture of Lizardfolk. So these characters are most likely not going to change into halflings or half-orcs or elves halfway through a campaign. So the culture of the Lizardfolk and the idea of where they come from is going to be relatively static. So that's going to be very important for me to work with. Let's see, is there anything else? Sibling Bond is another good one. All right, that might be something that I want to focus on. They're twins, all right? So, of course, that relationship between them is going to be very important. So it might be that down the line, Lex starts talking more, and she goes from primarily a rogue character to being a fighter or a sorcerer or who knows, tries to be a wizard. There are all different ways you can take your character in D&D, and it depends on who's playing as the character and how their taste changes over the course of the campaign. But chances are that sibling bond between two twins isn't going to be as easily severable. Even if one of them dies, that will still be an important role for the it'll still be an important driving factor for those characters. So I could stay here for as long as I could possibly want and try to come up with more, but I'll probably leave it here. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh yeah, I want to make a note. Eggs. Tertian harmony. All right, so that idea again, the idea of the obsession with the eggs, it'd be just kind of fun to try and sneak something in there. And the easy thing would to be, like I said, just throw in an E and then 2 G's into the motif. But that's almost a bit too easy, and I think the tertian harmony would be very useful. For example, if we were to do an E major to a G major, I don't have a piano set up at the moment, sorry, so I can't show that. But those would be 2 major chords separated by a minor third. That's a very dramatic sounding to it. That's actually a chord relationship that was made famous in Lord of the Rings. The primary theme for the Fellowship, that heroic movement, was 2 major chords separated by a minor third. So that's something similar we could do here. So we've got that. So we've got our first impressions. Now let's start going into a little more. Let's get a bit deeper into the weeds. So I like to summarize the story of the characters in 1 sentence, just so I can have a good idea. So twins that the twins that live only for each other. They live only for each other. Must fight their survival, both physically and I don't know how else to say it in terms of lore, because we can't forget that Ertos in particular wants to preserve the story of their tribe, of their family. They are the last 2 of their tribe, and they were banished from the larger tribe or whatever. And so it's very important to Ertos that he continues the story of his ancestors, of his family, of himself and his twin sister, so that their story continues to live after them. So that's just a quick way for me to keep in mind. So anytime that I am getting stuck, or as I start to develop the music a bit more and I want to start reflecting, it's very important for me to be able to immediately come back to this 1-sentence description. In fact, let's consider changing that to Courier New. I like to do this because it makes it stick out a bit more. What traits or characteristics are most important? All right, so these characters, loyalty, their Lizardfolk, or we'll say draconian culture. So loyalty, their draconian culture, the need for survival. All right, I'm going to say those are the most important. I don't want to get too crazy with this, because if I have a massive list of like 15 or so characteristics that are important, it then gets very difficult to try and capture all of those in the music. So I like to focus on just a few very key and important traits that I can try and work with. All right, so let's try a step-by-step progression of their story with general descriptions of energy level. All right, so this is typically what I do when I'm going with a more traditional story route. So if it's not so much a character, but an actual story, so programmatic music, music that tells a story, I'll typically flesh out step-by-step stories for each section in the music. So section A, section B, and then I'll assign a basic energy level to each of them. The idea being that 10 is the highest the energy level can possibly be. And that's typically reserved for the climax of the piece. And then 1 to 2 is typically the lowest that the energy will be in the entire piece. And all the other sections, after I have found out the lowest point and the highest point, all the other sections are given energy levels compared to those 2. So that later on when I'm planning the piece and writing the piece, I can keep that in mind when I start including different things like, all right, how big should the instrumentation be here? How rhythmically active should it be here? Stuff like that. And we'll get a lot more into that soon. But for now, let's focus instead on telling this story. So Right, step-by-step progression of their story with general descriptions of energy level. All right, so this is a bit difficult when you get into the character because I don't know their story. All right, that's another thing with D&D is the story is very fluid most of the time, so it's hard to try and get a linear progression going here. But so what ideas or themes are the most important to the character? Let's try answering these questions first. So we actually talked about these already. All right, so I'm getting a little redundant here, but loyalty, draconian culture, need for survival, and with the loyalty we'll put sibling bond. All right, so which aspects of this character do I really want to explore the deepest? All right, so again, I could put all three of these, but I actually have to start thinking about what would be most practical. Actually, you know what? Let's not worry about what would be practical for now. We'll get to that later. All right, at this point, yeah, it's going to be pretty boring. I'm just copying and pasting at this point. So this won't always be the case. Sometimes I'll have completely different things, and here are these. So for what traits or characteristics are the most important, sometimes that'll be different emotions. What ideas or themes are the most important to the character, that could be... so this could be like what's the most important to the story, then what's most important to the individual character. Since we're not really doing a broader picture and all of it comes down to the characters, all of these are going to be pretty similar to each other. All right, so what musical parameters can I use to explore these aspects? Here we go. All right, this is where it starts to get exciting. All right, starting with loyalty / sibling bond. All right, so which musical parameters can I use to explore these aspects? All right, so right off the bat, these are the 9 parameters. All right, we have register, timbre, pitch, harmony, rhythm, tempo, texture, articulation, and dynamics. So now that I've got an idea of which characteristics, which traits, which thematic ideas are the most important to this music and to these characters, now I can finally start going through each of these 9 parameters and start brainstorming how each of these can be used most effectively to try and represent each of these things. So right off the bat, loyalty and sibling bond, to me, the first thing that screams out would be timbre, all right, or tone color. So I'm thinking specific instruments used to represent each character. So right off the bat, thinking maybe like a flute for Lex, maybe it could be like a stringed instrument of some sort for Irtos. Those are just random examples, but picking specific instruments that are meant to represent each character, and then the different way that those instruments interact with each other can be used to help tell the story of their loyalty, of their bond with each other, things like that. I don't need to go too deep into this. At this point, this is still step one of meeting the characters. So the whole purpose is to just try to come up with some basic ideas and different things that I can get excited about, things to help inspire me when I start writing this material. So timbre could be used for that. Let's see if there's anything for register. Let's see. This one's a little reaching, in my opinion, but for register, having a 2 melodic lines, almost like contrapuntal. So like a melody and counter melody, and both in the same register. That could be used to potentially represent them. Not as confident about that one as I am about the timbre, but it's an idea, so I'm putting it down. Pitch. Again, you could do the cliche thing about assigning like a pitch register to each of them, but that would almost be like the opposite of what the register idea was. Harmony, nothing too much kind of maybe specific, like a specific CR, a specific chord relationship. Like, so picking a specific, like a major to a minor or a major to a major by a certain interval, picking a very specific harmonic interval and sound to represent them. And then, of course, this would be something where there's nothing intrinsic about the music that says this relates to the 2 siblings. It would be more about how do I use it, how do I use it while I'm structuring the music, when I'm coming up with stuff, when I'm brainstorming, when I'm writing it, to help make it represent them. Let's see, harmony, anything from the rhythm. Nothing's coming to mind right now. Tempo, I wouldn't want to mess with that too much at this stage, just personally. Texture, that's like how many layers we're going to have, melody, counter melody, harmony, comping, bass lines, stuff like that. So again, nothing particular screaming out to me. Articulation, nothing screaming at me. Dynamics, nothing screaming at me. So we'll just leave it. We've got 3 potential options. If I come up with anything else, I'll go with that. But let's see here. Next we have the Draconian Culture. This is where I'm really excited. All right, this is what gets me excited about these characters musically, is because it provides us an opportunity to invent our own musical palette, our own sound palette. So when you say tribal, when you say like prehistoric and ancient, to me, that doesn't scream string quartet. That doesn't scream traditional orchestra. Instead, it it gives me a let's try and go. No, I'm just gonna try and say it. To me, that says we want to invent our own sound. All right. So anytime you say tribal or ancient, 2 things come to mind, and that is rhythm. Rhythm is incredibly important. And flutes. So drums and flutes were some of the oldest instruments ever invented, right up there with the human voice of singing. And so in every culture in the world, you'll find that flutes and drums track back thousands and thousands of years, because humans were just very quick to understand that when you blow on something that makes a sound, you can use that. And they were also very quick to understand, because these are both things that occur very frequently in life all around us. When you are walking, each footstep, that's a rhythm. Your heart rate is a rhythm. The pattern of breathing in and out is a rhythm. And as you get more energy and exert yourself, that rhythm speeds up, and it's just very intrinsic to us. And then there are constant examples of different things throughout nature where you can just hear natural flutes. It can happen in reeds. It can happen with birds. All kinds of things that you can notice that create sound in nature. And so for me, it's just, I might be rambling at this point, but it's an awesome opportunity to do something more than just the traditional orchestra. So for me, right off the bat, I want to sample. I want to create my own instruments for this. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to use the orchestra. A great example of this strategy is actually in Disney's Raya the Last Dragon that just came out. When it first came out, I went to see I took my notebook to take some notes on how the music was used. I had my hat that I'm wearing right now, which has like a little light on it so I could take notes. I was the only one in the theater because I went to an 11 a.m. matinee on a Monday to make sure that I was the only one there. And I took notes on how the music was used. And James Newton Howard, I believe, did the score. Really cool stuff he did is most of the movie takes place in a fantasy world inspired by Southeast Asia, I believe. And so the majority of the music focused on an ensemble of instruments from Southeast Asia. All the music was based on it. Now, anytime additional emotion or additional power were needed, that's when he would add the orchestra, never removing the original core ensemble, but using the orchestra to supplement it. And that's the same strategy I want to use in this. I want to create a core ensemble responsible for the primary theme. And then as we explore the different emotional themes and genres seen throughout it, and the many ways that we're going to have to rearrange it to create our suite, I want to then introduce the orchestra and other instruments to help with that. But so right off the bat, let's get back on this. We've got our Draconian culture. So going through our 9 basic parameters, we've got register. Nothing's jumping out to me. Timbre is a really big one. All right, drums. Drums are going to be huge. Flutes. So for singing, maybe sampling some lizards. So maybe like find some samples of alligators or Komodo dragons or something hissing. We could maybe try to find a cool way to add that into the music. We're going to have metallic percussion is going to be very important. Hitting metal against metal, rocks against rocks, wood against wood. Those are all going to be very important. and maybe some basic stringed instruments, preferably plucked, just from what I'm thinking right off the bat. So I'm excited about that. I'm really excited about creating a sound palette for that, and we'll cover more of that in future videos. But so we've got timbre. Let's see what else we got. Pitch. Nothing's coming to mind. Harmony. All right, harmony. Non-functional. All right, so the idea of functional harmony of tonic, subdominant, and dominant chord families is a relatively modern music convention, and fairly specific to Western music in particular. So I'm going to focus tertian. We'll say so, maybe tertian, modal, maybe modal would be very useful, both of which have more ancient sound to them. Not too many sustained chords. Mostly a melodic voice, a bass line, and maybe a counter melody. Again, chords as we know them today are a relatively modern convention. The most basic and most ancient music was typically just monophonic, just a melody. Then maybe sometimes melody with a bass line underneath it to help provide a little more contrast. And then eventually multiple voices written contrapuntally. Then from the original counterpoint and the traditions that came with that, then eventually we got the chords. But so if I want to make sure that this music sounds a bit more ancient, I want to make sure that I'm avoiding the traditional chords, at least for the primary theme. I can introduce them later, but I will want to focus more on implied harmony. Meaning that the way the voices interact implies certain chords, but we don't actually use the chords themselves. All right, so that's going to be very important for us. Harmony, let's see what else we got. Harmony, rhythm is going to be super important. All right, this entire thing is going to be based off of rhythm for the most part. Most ancient music was very rhythmic in nature, and when we look at tribal and prehistoric, primitive, all these descriptions of the lizard folk, I want to make sure that the rhythm is a very key central part. So I'm right off the bat thinking odd meter. So I'm thinking something like 7/8 time. Odd meter being a combination of both simple meter, which divides the beat by 2, so 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Then you've got compound meter, which divides each beat into 3, so 1E and a 2E and a 3E. No, that's sorry, I say 1 tuplet, 2 tuplet, 3 tuplet, 4 tuplet kind of thing. Each one is broken into 3. Odd meter is a combination of the two. So in 7/8, you could count that as 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 or 1 2 1 2 3 1 2. The idea is it's a combination of the two. It has a very unique feel to it. That's something that you can look up if you're interested in learning more, or I can do something on it later in a different video. But right at the bat, I want to use odd meter because that's going to separate us from the stereotypical 4/4 time, 3/4 time, all those common simple meters that we're used to in most modern music. All right, irregular accents are also very important in folk music. Very common in folk music, and that's what I want to use as well. I want to give this a much more folky feel to it. And okay, yeah, those are the main things coming to mind right now. Maybe I'll add some later, but for now, let's move on to tempo. Thinking tempo, very rubato. All right, so the idea, I want it to be more like you feel it. I don't want it to sound like there's an actual metronome counting every step of the way. That can be a little difficult to make it sound rubato in a DAW, where everything's much more metrically written. But I'd like to make it sound a little bit more natural and playable, as if it's being played by ear and not necessarily by a metronome. So that'll be important for it. See, so tempo, texture. Texture, again, having to do with with the types of layers we have. So I'm thinking melody, bass line, and rhythmic voices are going to be the most important. Occasionally a counter melody for added color and texture. All right. And again, none of these are written in stone. I can always come back and add something else to it if I'd like. But for now, these are some nice, useful things. Articulation. Let's see. I'm thinking a nice mixture of staccato and legato. I want a nice combination of short and crisp attacks and more lyrical balances. So like ba ba da ba da, or something just like that. The combination again is very common in folk music. That erratic nature, the idea of feeling the music and going where it feels more, as it feels more naturally, is very common in folk music, and not so much necessarily what would be proper or what would be structured, as would be sounded more commonly in concert music or more academic pieces. And dynamics, nothing really comes to mind for dynamics for me at the moment. But right off the bat, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 of the 9 parameters are going to really help bring out this draconian culture in the music. And I think this one's going to be the most important for helping to bring out the original and just like the get the like original unique identity to this theme that's going to make it a lot more personal to each of these characters. So draconian culture. Then we had the need for survival. Okay, need for survival. This one, this one is a bit tricky. Actually, I just remembered something. Pitch has to do with your melody and your choices, modal and pentatonic in nature. All right, so that's just a good idea that just came to me. Because again, lots of folk music is very modal, based off tetrachords, which is like, well, for lack of a better word, made-up or non-traditional scales. Lots of folk melodies are pentatonic in nature. So that's just something to keep in mind when I'm writing the melody. Again, don't need to stick religiously to that, but it'd be something to work with. So the need for survival, the biggest one that I'm feeling for this is going to be rhythm. Very rhythmically driven. I want a lot of the momentum of the theme to come from the rhythm. For me, that just screams a bit more primitive, a bit more urgency. But we'll see. We'll see. Maybe I'll come up with something else. But for right now, right off the bat, it looks like the biggest factor, the biggest personality trait, if you will, of the music is going to focus on this draconian culture. All right. Need for survival will have a little bit of impact, not as much as we did for the draconian. And these will also, the loyalty and sibling bond, that's going to be more tricky. That's a lot more abstract, since that's more of a kind of it's more like a value, like a soft value, or of like the listener, whereas draconian culture is a lot more quantitative. It's something that we can actually account for and try to purposely shift things that will just sound like that. There's nothing that we could really do that someone's going to listen to it and go, oh, that sounds like sibling bond or loyalty or anything like that. Not as easily as we can manipulate these things and people think, ooh, that sounds unique. But all right, so what emotions do I want to explore the deepest? This one would, again, have to do more on a storyline focused, but here we have the 4 arrangements that we're going to be doing. So for each of these we're going to write a primary theme, and then from the primary theme, we are going to rearrange it to fit 4 other contexts. And the winners from the Patreon votes were a relaxing theme, so something more about like downtime, like the characters are in a town, no danger, just something to show that they're safe. Battle music, sad music for emotional moments, and then an ambient theme. I'm thinking something more like walking through a dungeon kind of music, where there's not any particular danger present at the moment, but kind of setting the mood for imminent danger. Something is inevitably going to pop out in a dungeon. So these are the 4 that we're going to do. All right, so next we are going to do our parameters again. All right, so which musical parameters can I use to explore these aspects? Relaxation. So let's see, timbre. Let's see, stringed instruments. Flute are very good for that. The only other one really sticking out to me would be tempo, lower energy, lower tempo, rhythm, less rhythmically driving, harmony, we can say focusing more on good vibe sounds, and let's also say functional harmony is more permissible. And my reasoning for this is going to be they're in a town. All right, so that's no longer the focus just on these characters and their culture and more about how they are interacting with all of the many different cultures surrounding them in whatever town they happen to be in. So in that case, functional harmony is much more reliable for setting just a nice vibe. So we can use that. Is there anything else? Because I don't want to get too deep into details for these yet, because I want to make sure that we've written the primary theme before we start tackling each of these parameters. In fact, I'm actually going to come back to this later. So I'll do each of these later once we have the primary theme written out. That way I have a better idea of what our raw material is, what our starting point is, and then we can start talking about how we're going to manipulate these different factors. All right, and so what organizational strategy will work best for bridging them together? All right, so these are just different strategies that I've read about, learned about, different things that I've used. So leitmotif, that's a typical motivic idea throughout music. A fragmented motif is a shorter idea. It's a smaller, short idea. It's not necessarily a long lyrical phrase. It's maybe just a couple beats long. Maybe it's an interval or a rhythmic figure. Something that can be placed here or there just to have a hint towards a specific idea. An integrated theme would be like maybe I have, well, that wouldn't really fit for this. It's more for like film music. That's, for example, where you have one primary theme for an entire movie, and it just gets rearranged to fit whatever scenarios are. So it's the one theme, then you rearrange it for sadness, you arrange it for happiness. So that's technically what we're going to do here, but that doesn't give us too much in terms of, like, it's not very useful in terms of organizing our ideas in this at this moment. And repeating musical template, that's the idea of not necessarily having a specific thematic idea, but you have a specific idea of using, all right, so in the high tense moments, we'll bring in lots of drums, we'll bring in lots of brass, maybe an electric guitar to double with the high trumpets. Like, you have a specific idea of what the music will look like and not necessarily the thematic ideas. I'm going to say leitmotif and fragmented motif. And these aren't the only ones. There are lots of strategies you can go with. These are just some of my favorites. But for me, leitmotif, so the thematic, melodic ideas, and then a shorter fragmented version of it is going to be the most useful. All right, so let's actually call it here for a minute. We've finished step 1. I had been hoping to go through all of this all the way up to step 5, where we could start sketching. But we'll do one more video where we're planning out everything. Right now it is getting unbearably hot in this room right now. I'm starting to sweat pretty bad. So but we'll call it here for this video. I hope this is useful. All right. If you have any questions, if it doesn't seem clear, or if there's anything else you'd like to see me expand on more, please let me know. I would be more than happy to explain. Like I said, I don't plan on explaining. There's no script I've written for any of this. I'm just kind of winging it and sharing my actual process. I'm coming up with these ideas as you're watching. So yeah, we'll see. The plan is to edit down these videos. So I'll release both a full-length video, and then down the line I'll release an edited one where it's a lot more concise and gets more straight to the point, so that if you don't have time to watch the full videos, we'll have those available. But so thank you very much. The special thanks goes out to Declan and for these incredible characters and the incredible inspiration for this music that we're working on together. For all of my incredibly generous and wonderful patrons, I do plan on uploading these notes to Patreon. So as I'm updating them, I'll upload them on there. I'll upload the blank template that I had originally written out, so you can use that for yourself. Again, those will all be on Patreon. But yes, so thank you so much, everybody. I hope it's useful. In the meantime, keep studying, keep working hard, and as always, keep writing new music. All right? Best of luck.